because we don't know the real causes of the consequences or impact, or even we don't fully know that the probability. So we're missing the both parts of the equation. So we have to focus on this. So we're missing the full information, and so based on this, we cannot 100% make risk assessment precisely. Otherwise, we need to make a comprehensive collection of information from different sources and consider different conditions, and we should put on our consideration the different expertise and the context. So thanks, Dr. Tim, for this.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Ali is one of the technical people on Africa CDC Certification Committee. They are going to be certifying a few people after they have trained them in Africa. So I guess that's why he had a lot of interest in the training aspects of the program. All right, so we are going to move into our program for today. I'm going to introduce our first facilitator of the day, after which she will present the package that she has for us. All right. So our facilitator is Dr. Natalie Jingma, who is a synthetic biologist and also biotech entrepreneur that has quite a good number of years of experience in building biotech companies from Novatech to good at the bedside and beyond. She is passionate about experimenting, learning, creating, and ensuring humanity's survival on and off planet. And she was head of business development at Felix Biotech, a company developing products using phage therapy. So during the pandemic, she spoke quite a bit about how biotech companies were affected by the pandemic, and I'm hoping we can have a bit of experience on that so that going forward, we know how to equip the private sector to be ready to respond to such unseen circumstances that have potential to cause massive danger. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Jingma to facilitate a session on response to GCBR's experience from the private industry. Dr. Natalie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ian, and thanks also for being flexible on the timing. Good morning, everyone there. It is 10:30 p.m. here, and I'm definitely
recording in
more
progress.
an evening person than a morning person. So did not want this presentation at 5 a.m. in the morning from me. So I was really grateful for Ian giving me the chance to talk. He gave a great overview to sort of what I plan to discuss. And, you know, as I had sort of started thinking about the sort of question of the role of industry, it evolved into something much larger. So we can definitely focus on sort of like the biotech capability, but realistically speaking, I'm not going to know sort of the resources and the context of your individual regions. And so I made this a much more general, how do you engage private industry across all sectors so that you can get them pulling in the same direction for a global catastrophic biological risk. So I'll share slides if technology allows, and we'll get started. Really quickly, one other thing, I'm a fairly casual / sort of interactive presenter, so please feel free to interrupt with questions of any kind. I totally don't think it's disrespectful. I think that that's the best way to have a good conversation. Ian gave me an introduction already, but just really quickly to recap, I'm an entrepreneur and synthetic biologist. I also am a world traveler, so I backpack quite a bit. In terms of like my goals in life, it's mostly to find out what can I be useful, what can I do that's useful in the world, and did sort of bounce around in my career, so I have a background and experience in environmental science and plant science, as well as a PhD in synthetic biology. Backpacked around the world to 5 continents, did not get to Africa or Antarctica, So apologies there. And then with a biosecurity fellow through the Johns Hopkins Emerging Leader in Biosecurity program, which is how I started learning about global catastrophic biological risks, as well as pandemics, as well as the One Health sort of concept. At the same time, I was a consultant with Clearview Healthcare Partners, so sort of looking at the healthcare system. And after that, jumped into building startups, where I've sort of been going since, building and advising startups across a variety of fields, most recently in infectious disease. So we're going to take a pause there because I want you to do something that maybe we haven't done in a while, which is imagine your life before the pandemic. Like, go ahead, take a couple of seconds. Imagine like that happiest day you had in your life pre-pandemic, and what did you do? What were the experiences like? What was happening? All right, hopefully you've had a good brief flashback to a time before pandemics. And I talk about pandemics in this because this is our closest analogy to a global catastrophic biological risk. Ian did a great job sort of recapping today how we have key differences here. And we're never going to know the risk we're facing, but we can sort of approximate some of the key things that we might need to face over and over, which is the capacity to isolate, the capacity to test and trace. A lot of these things will be recurrent in global catastrophic biological risks because a lot of them will share the same underlying structures of threat, usually DNA or RNA basis. Very rarely will we get a protein-based threat. And contagion will be a continuous issue, like the transmissibility is what we care about. But I wanted to ask you to do this mostly as a motivator for like, why are we trying to engage industry, right? So you have a ton of powers in policy, in governance, but there is a huge amount of sort of power, inertia, capability in industry that you also want to engage when you face a global catastrophic biological risk or a global catastrophic risk of any kind. And so when I started thinking about the question of what to talk about, and Ian prompted me of, talk about your experience in private industry, I started thinking about, what kind of framework is there to engage industry on this? And I realized maybe the best framework is from industry. And this is just sort of an outline of it. And you might recognize this is some very basic questions, like open-ended, what, who, when, where, how, and why questions that we'll go through in this presentation. And I want to just call out here, this is definitely a work. As you go through this framework, ask yourself, what could be missing from this? What could we add to it to make it better? What could we take away from it to make it better? But starting out, the first thing is, what is this? This is essentially a framework to engage private industry. And the main thing I want to call out is this is what we do in startups. So I spend most of my time finding problems, talking to experts about why those problems exist and pulling apart what exactly those problems are, and then figuring out solutions to actually solve or address those problems in exchange for money. And the entirety of private industry is doing this, right? You're providing some sort of value, being a resource or good, a service, something in exchange for money. And so this framework is what we do with startups. Like, we send startups to go talk to 100 people, and it is legitimately talk to 100 people and figure out what their market is, what the problem is that they're facing. And in the same way, you can use this to engage private industry to understand, how are they going to respond to a global catastrophic biological risk? How are they going to respond to something like a pandemic? And the really sort of your end goal is, how are we going to operate in this situation? Again, I've used the word pandemic here because it's our closest analogy. So who should be participating in this framework? I've highlighted sort of 3 people here. It's always less lonely to work on a team. But essentially, it's someone who understands how the money flows, right? Like, how is money being transferred from one place to another? How is it flowing from government in response? If a GCBR happens, like, how is that going to flow out into private industry, to individual people? Here in the US, there has been a huge response in terms of like pandemic response loans, and that have kept businesses afloat essentially during the pandemic, provided you didn't lay anyone off. You also want someone who I think broadly understands biomedical research, and I biomedical in parentheses here, because I think you could have someone who understands research very well as well, but the biomedical component of it is important because GCBRs are inherently going to have a biological component to them. So having someone with expertise there is critical. And then the last person who should be involved is someone who understands the process to make decisions in your country, in the region, even at individual people level, right? It's like, how are these decisions going to get made by individuals, by local governments, and so forth? So let me pause there before we jump into the next slide and see if there are any questions. Okay, when is the best time to use this framework? Before the GCBR, before the pandemic, since we had COVID-19 as the training ground for GCBRs, I think I don't need to dwell on the chaos that we had as a result of that. Some countries' responses were better than others. Some of them, even at the regional level, some regions' responses were better than others. But I think one of the critical things is starting this and having an understanding of how private industry is going to respond to a global catastrophic risk before you have the global catastrophic risk, right? And sort of to Ian's point around the question of, what can private industry offer? We can only offer things or be prepared to offer things if we thought about it. Realistically, a lot of the lives of folks in private industry, people who are leading companies, are very tied up in what needs to happen day to day, which is I need to hire X number of people for our company to grow. I need to make sure that we are compliant with these regulations. I need to make sure that our sales are growing X amount so that we're able to hit our next milestones and make our next funding. So to fit into private industry and get them aware, you have to engage them in some way and have them thinking about the question. There are certain industry leaders that I think are more, so groups like Ginkgo Bioworks have been thinking about this for a very long time. And I know folks there, I think that they've done some really great work. But for the majority of people, that sort of biosecurity awareness is not something that's top of mind because they have 100 other things to worry about in private industry. Now, in terms of like what you have in your pandemic and or GCBR preparedness response, right? It's like, what can you engage private industry in? This sort of stretches across all aspects of society. And again, we can talk a little bit about sort of the biological aspects of it, the biomedical or biotech aspects of it. But I've just sort of built this framework here to sort of help us think about all the sort of categories of resources available. And they fall into two big categories. You have people. So you have the personnel, the individual humans, all living within the affected region or country. And then you have actual physical materials of some kind, goods, equipment, and so forth. And then they sort of fall into three concentric circles, things that are sort of essential for the response to the pandemic or specific global catastrophic biological risk, right? And again, I know we've talked about us being totally unable to anticipate where the GCBR is going to come from or what exactly it will look like. But I think that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you can get a pretty good idea of what it might look like just based on understanding of biology, right? In terms of threats, we were aware that this family of Coronavirinae was, I think it was identified as the top 5 viruses that would cause an issue because they would become a global pandemic because of its high mutation rate as an RNA virus and its frequent zoonotic transmissions, jumps between animals and humans that had already happened with SARS and MERS. So this wasn't totally out of the blue. The upside was, I mean, if you look at what happened with the vaccine response, we didn't start from scratch with the vaccine. So BioNTech had already started working on a MERS vaccine before COVID-19 happened. In fact, a couple of companies had done this. And so when COVID-19 happened, they had been doing that as a side project. It was mostly because they had funding from a defense agency, so a national government for an award for this. And they dusted all of that off and got working on it because they realized this is the same family of virus. So that puts you light years ahead already. And I think is a good illustration of this is why you should be funding private industry to be looking to some extent at GCBRs, because you can start incentivizing some of this preparedness before the pandemic, before the GCBR happens. So in terms of categories, pandemic, and then essential. And what I mean by essential here is we're talking about entities that are essential for function in society, right? These are the core services or goods, things that need to happen no matter what to keep people alive in the society. And then the third category is sort of non-essential. So we'll go through these sort of three categories and how to sort of interact with them to understand these aspects of private industry and how they can help respond to a GCBR. So let's sort of talk about what is essential to respond to the GCBR, that first circle, the innermost circle. Again, even not knowing what that GCBR is going to look like, here we have on the left the personnel broadly who I imagine would be the people that you would want. The first of them are medical staff, right? So GCBR is going to attack, be it people, and it's going to eventually boil down to, so even in the case you had an agricultural thing, you would have probably health effects of that, right? And so they're going to be critical to this. Testing staff, so you need to figure out what's wrong and how does this threat work, right? So they're going to be a set of staff that are core and working directly on this problem. Community leaders are critical, and I think this was super underlooked in the pandemic. It's probably not really considered a business, but I believe like most institutions, even nonprofits and like religious organizations, are entities that are within the private sector that have a lot to contribute because they are trusted, right? And you want to understand, what their incentives are as well to get them involved in any kind of GCBR response. And then public health and contact tracers. So it's like, how is this thing transmitting or moving? Even in a world where we're not dealing with, let's say we're dealing with a GCBR that is not a human health threat, so an agricultural threat or pest, right? You still would need somebody to do some kind of contact tracing, someone that's moving, someone at the same time that risks transmitting the thing, that is aware and understanding of the risks that they are taking and the procedures to mitigate those risks. And the questions that you want to be asking are sort of these questions. These are just examples, but who are they and how do they operate, right? What is it that they need to work and what would block them from working? Because one of the things that we saw in the pandemic was so much in the hospital system, which in the US are often in the private sector, grind to a halt because of resource limitations. Just didn't have enough ventilators, right? And so it was this insane problem where we couldn't get more ventilators. You literally can't manufacture more overnight. And the medical staff were like, we don't know what else we can do except starting to decide who lives and who dies, right? And then that sort of flows into the next part, which is here on the other side, you have materials. So again, from the pandemic perspective, things like personal protective equipment and sanitizer are critical to sort of contain a GCBR, right? Like this is something required from medical staff, for testing staff, for anyone who's interacting with anyone potentially infectious or potentially infectious or contaminated area. The other thing is lab reagents and equipment. This was something nobody had really thought about, surprisingly, when we ended up in the pandemic, but we started running out of PCR reagents, right? And so many tests were being run on the COVID-19 virus, and a lot of them were PCR based, that we were running out of some of the just mundane like reagents that would go into the PCR reaction. This was one of them. Polymerase is literally the protein that makes DNA strands in the PCR reaction that we then detect to tell whether or not the virus is present. Running short on that. Some of, like I said, the reagents, I can't remember the exact reagent's name. Ask me about it after and I'll find you the link. But we were literally running out of that because there weren't that many companies making it beforehand. It turns out when you go from needing, let's say, 100 units or 100 bottles of this to suddenly 10,000 bottles of this stuff a year, a company can't just go and make that. So seeing where those things are coming from and then going to those groups, right, and asking, okay, well, what happens if I suddenly need 100 times more gloves? What happens if we suddenly need 40 times more of this reagent? Like, how quickly and how flexibly can you move to fill that need? And then the third thing is information sharing. And I highlight this as a resource because we tend to think of it as metaphysical, but realistically, it relies on things like having up-to-date computers and networks, right? Up-to-date ways to reach people, whether that's by mobile phone, whether that's by app, whether that's by a community computer in regions that don't have full computer and internet access, right? And so for all of these things, you're asking, you know, how much of it do we as a country or region have? How much are we going to need? And that is concentric, right? So like you can imagine a single region being affected by a GCBR that you're trying to contain or address before it becomes the true global risk, to an entire country in a pandemic situation where it's already spread everywhere and you're working across regions to try and contain and mitigate the damage. Where can we get these from? What happens if supply is disrupted, right? And so one of the things that happened was we couldn't get enough gloves or masks in the pandemic. And early on, there was a huge argument over whether N95 masks should be going to the general public versus giving them to doctors, right, who were at the front lines in the hospitals. And I have a friend who is a physician, and literally we started figuring out, can you sterilize the N95s? Can you, like, how do you sterilize them? And they had worked out a way where they could expose them to UV in like under like a PCR hood. You have these hoods in lab. They're used for totally different purpose, but you want them to be clean and sterile. So they emit ultraviolet light that kills everything, all the bacteria. And we throw the N95s into them and then test them and be like, okay, that actually works. So there's a way for us to reuse these if supply is disrupted. And then I think the hardest question is, if this is going to be needed elsewhere, how are we going to allocate it? And I got to this a little bit earlier with, you have a zero-sum game that in many places you will be fighting where multiple entities, be it pandemic or essential services, need a resource. How are you going to allocate that and play that game? And you won't know how to do that until you see how much of it people are routinely using and what they need in private industry. So pause there really quickly. Any questions before we move on to the next concentric circle? Awesome.
A leader or something like that?
That is an excellent question, and one that I will say I don't fully have the answer to yet. So when I look at how the pandemic played out in the US, one of the biggest problems we had was that people in the media, I think on both sides very transparently, capitalized on the pandemic to drive, I would say, their own brand, right? And so to like drive revenue, drive clicks in some way, and this sort of dark pattern of how all of the news now is ad revenue driven instead of paid per information driven. We could talk about that off screen, but broadly when I say community leaders here, I mean people who are trusted, close leaders who people in communities see in person. So I think good examples of this here in the US would be like pastors, church leaders. These are people that the community is going to for trust and advice. In some cases, these are like social workers and therapists for disrupted communities who are the only ones that go in there. And this brings me to another point, which is you have the ability to leverage private industry, I think, and these entities that are not government policy to help mitigate a lot of the secondary effects of a GCBR, that intense fear, the uncertainty, and so forth. Because if you can engage them early and help them understand, here are the possible things that could happen, and here's how you can help in that scenario, they're much more, you have a relationship then at that point, right? You can then go to them when the crisis actually happens and you can tell them, this is the real deal. This is really happening now. We are going to need your help. And it's not the first time you're talking to them. They're not asking, who are you and why should we, be trusting you? They can understand where you're coming from and say, yes, let me go talk to, the people who attend, my church, my mosque, and I preach to. Let me go talk to the people who are within my broader classroom or community that I see every day, and explain to them what's going on. And that'll be hopefully useful in the next couple of slides. Does that answer your question?
Yes, we are in the same page indeed. I am completely agree with you that the leaders or the community leaders by this description is very important and have the great impact on the society and to respond to the catastrophic effect. But if this is the case, what about the policymakers? Because also we should consider the policymaker as a people to get, I think they are very essential in the response.
Yeah, 100%. So when I put this framework together, I imagine the policymakers as the people running around on the ground doing this. So they are the people asking the questions in this case and building all of these bridges, right? It's people in government, people in policy, because they're the ones who are planning for this before it happens. Like I said, private industry, a lot of us are focusing on the day-to-day and keeping our companies afloat. So they are the key stars, I'd say, in this, in making sure this framework and a framework to respond to a GCBR is in place before it happens, ideally.
Yes, great. My second question regarding the material, I have 2 points here. The first point is that the sampling, I missing the sampling in the material, and this is very essential indeed. What's your opinion?
So you mean sampling for a variety, before you go into testing, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I had sort of broadly categorized these. We could add a sampling category, but I sort of thought about it as a lab reagent. So for example, lab reagent equipment would be the entire kit for COVID, right? So if you look at COVID, you have the nylon brush, and those ended up being in shortage for a while as well. That directly actually impacted a project I ended up doing where we had to give all the nylon brushes away because it was more important to test for COVID than it was to do our microbiome study. So that if you put that in that category, we can also definitely call it out though. And I just want to say, if you're taking notes right now directly on what's on the slides, you don't have to worry about it because I'm going to send these slides to Ian right afterward, and you will have full access to them to add that category yourself to review them however much you want.
Yes, great. I asking this question because I am thinking like that. We are working on the framework, focusing on the sharing of both the sampling and information and data. So I focus on this because we are already working on this framework. Okay, that's great. The second point is that I also found you missing the countermeasure regarding the material. You're missing the countermeasure like vaccines and drugs. They're very essential.
They are essential. This assumes we do not yet have them. So this assumes a risk that we don't know how to respond to yet. I'm going to get to medicines in the next thing. We can, if you imagine a world in which we have a response to a GCBR, you could add that to this list. In the case of COVID, we did not have this. We just had palliative care. One other thing I would say here is we'll get into this in terms of logistics and transport, but the way the U.S. has set up its sort of medical countermeasures program, we have essentially depots across the U.S. where things are placed. We had, as part of that PPE, if I remember correctly, and while we had the storage, implementation or distribution of this became super challenging because it wasn't clear from the beginning who was going to get what, sort of going to this point. So I think if we were to add this question of, if you have a medical countermeasure in place, who is going to get it and where is it going to go becomes an even more critical question, right? So I 100% agree with you on both of those points, and those are categories we can definitely add to this.
Thank you, thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to move a little quickly through the next set of slides just so we can hopefully keep us on time.
There's one more question, Natalie. One more question here.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie, for above your speak. You have said above the pandemic, COVID has changed many things. For example, the use of vaccination before the end of clinical trial. Do you think this cannot do something ever for the biosecurity of the patient? Because we don't have enough data for use of the vaccine.
Oh, that's a hard question. So like essentially that's a question of risk, right? It's like how much risk are we willing to take on the safety of something before we distribute it widely? And that risk profile has changed over time. So I mean, if you look at the original smallpox vaccine, so this is known as ACAM 2000 in the US. It is actually a live vaccinia virus. It's terrible is the short answer. So the risk profile on that is it will give people who are immunocompromised pretty horrific disease. It will abort fetuses and pregnant women. It will flake off in people with skin disorders and transmit itself to other people. It is basically a vaccine you would not really want to give to anyone writ large, right? And yet we stockpile huge doses of this in the US because for the majority of the population, that risk profile is something we would be willing to take in the event of a smallpox attack, right? And so here's an example of a GCBR where we have a response, and actually we know the risks and they're terrible, but we've decided that, you know, based on what's available to us today, we are going to use this only in case of emergency, but we stopped vaccinating the broader population. Now, the question that you get to, which is, you know, how do you handle this in the absence of information, is a really challenging one that I don't think that as science or even private industry can answer on its own. It is, we can provide data in clinic, right? We can provide clinical trials. And I mean, some of the most amazing things in the last 10 years, I'd say, are watching clinical trials evolve from your standard 2-arm randomized blinded placebo-controlled trial to more adaptive strategies. This has been driven by both oncology studies, studies of cancer, as well as studies for Ebola, right? Looking at ring vaccination to see whether or not vaccination is effective. And those, I think, are ways we can get the data and buy down, you know, some of that uncertainty without having, like, and then allowing us to sort of make a decision, right? So to sort of sidestep your question, in a place where you don't have any information, you can't make an informed decision, but there are strategies for us to get information more effectively than there were even 10 years ago. And there will be better strategies to get information like this around risk of using something as well as versus risk of disease as we go forward in the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So second category, hopefully moving through this a little more quickly to keep you all on time, like is, you know, what's essential to survival / minimize human suffering during this whole period. I think that we all saw sort of the response to the pandemic. It was various. Actually, you know, I think that it's also incredibly varied. Some of the countries had a much better time than others, but at least in the US, it was in many places a near total shutdown. It became a question of who is considered essential. And I think I highlighted the critical question here, which is who to move around to do their job. And at the bottom, deciding who is essential before the pandemic, because private industry is highly motivated to generate revenue, continue working, right? And so you had situations of very sort of perverse incentives here in the US where once there was a call that went out like, oh, you know, you are considered essential if you meet these 3 criteria. There were tons of companies who were like, yes, we meet these key criteria. You should make us essential. We should be allowed to go into work, when they should not have been allowed to go into work. This wasn't critical for the pandemic response. So deciding that in advance is a great way to get around that. But essentially, here are a few categories of people that I would consider important to go ask questions of, right? It's like, what do you need to do your jobs? Like, what's going to happen if there is a blocker? Things like medical support staff became a huge issue. Infrastructure and maintenance became a huge issue. Like, how are you going to keep things running? And a lot of this is predicated on, you have a group of people here responding to the pandemic. What do they need to survive, right? They don't operate in isolation. And your category of materials also grew. So one of the big problems that we had here in the West was there were tons of medical staff responding to COVID, getting COVID, And then there was not enough staff to actually help people to routine things, or more concerning, you had patients who were essentially not able to get help or dying, not because they had COVID, because hospitals were overwhelmed. A second problem we had was that people wouldn't come into clinic. So they needed care, but they were afraid to come get care, right? And so it's like, how do you distribute medicines to people who need them when they're not going to come into clinic, right? How are you going to get these resources to people when essentially you're shutting down a region or an entire country to respond to a global catastrophic biological risk? I'm going to jump to the next slide really quickly. I'm sure there'll be questions on that slide as well, but I wanted to get to this one really because there is also a key role for what I call non-essential people to play in this pandemic. And a lot of this, I think, was a cause of a lot of problems and challenges in this current pandemic because we didn't have a clear idea of, what could these people do. They are from a range of industries. I think the biggest takeaway here, looking at sort of the questions, is what would motivate them to minimize their risk and continue to engage them, because you have a group of people in this situation who want to do things, who want to be helpful. So in the U.S., because we didn't have enough testing capacity, we actually had graduate students who were trained in biology. They're not diagnostics technicians, but they essentially self-organized into a lab and started taking COVID samples from local communities to supplement testing capacity. And so being aware of, what do these people do and how might you be able to plug in during a pandemic, during a global catastrophic biological risk? How could you actually help, right? We had people who were just knitting things or making cards, which you think of as rather maybe silly or frivolous, but it kept them occupied. And those things then flowed to people who were working really hard in the community and helped them feel valued. Like, all of these 23-hour work days that they were doing, there was value in that. Someone was recognizing it. And I think those are sort of some of the success stories of the pandemic, which we tend to sort of, I think, sometimes write off as feel-good stories and not sort of celebrate enough. But if we're social creatures, like the ability to participate in some way helps all of the people who cannot do anything feel like they have a semblance of power, and then at the same time motivate them to actually comply and follow the rules that enable us to essentially defeat a GCBR pandemic sooner. In the same way, you had a range of goods that could be repurposed. So, there are a lot of things in personal care and cosmetics that are like a form of sanitizer. You can repurpose those. We had people that were cutting apart clothes to make masks. And another thing I want to highlight here is like entertainment activities. If this is a short GCBR risk, which, there have been some biological risks that have been very short in duration because they're limited attacks. But if it's a GCBR, chances are we're in it for a while. This is like a month, years thing. What entertainment activities can be done safely, right? Like, and this was something that was a huge front topic at the beginning of the Are there contactless ways to deliver these kinds of things? Keep some, again, anchor of normalcy and normal life for all of the people in the population, including the people who are responding as essential, including the people who are working directly on the pandemic. So let me pause there really quickly. I know that we're over time, but we'll take any questions. But overall, actually, I do have one more slide. Hold on, I'll take questions after the last two slides. Another thing that we didn't really focus enough on was what happens after the pandemic, right? It's like, what can industry do to contribute? And as a policymaker, what can you think about to help return to pre-pandemic or pre-GCBR baseline, right? It's essentially what you're experiencing as a society as a collective trauma. This is something I don't think happened super well for COVID because nobody had any experience in it, but we're figuring out, when are we done? When are we deciding this is normal, even if it's never fully normal? What's needed for recovery and how long it's going to take to recover is critical. And the why, right here is the better we prepare, the more quickly we recover from a pandemic or a GCBR, which I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room because you're already here motivated to help tackle this problem. So hopefully that gave you an idea of the industry overall and how you could get them to plug into a global catastrophic biological risk. My contact information is here, and I'll hand these slides over to Ian afterward. And my asks for you are, as the wonderful people whose questions you've already chimed in, what are your thoughts? How would you improve or change this? Was it useful? And what can you take from it to implement in pandemic or GCBR preparedness? So I'll pause there, take any questions, and thank you again for the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Natalie, for that wonderful session. Do you have any questions here? On how we can prepare for potential GCBR? Any questions? Those who are online, you simply raise your hand and I'll pick on you to ask your question. Is the assumption that all of us have understood fully? We know who is essential, non-essential, and who is critical for a response?
Or it could just not be useful, Ian. You're already all experts here that I'm talking to. I just happen to be a person from industry who works in startup.
All right. If you have no questions for Dr. Natalie, I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Natalie, for joining us so late that side and for the wonderful session. And we look forward to having you as a part of the Citizen by Africa family going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Take care and be well, everyone.
All right. So we are going to have a quick modification to the agenda. We are going to have Dr. Susan's session coming right after this. Let me introduce her.
I'm ready, Ian.
All right, I'm just looking for
Okay.
your bio here. Okay.
Are you looking for my presentation?
Nope, I'm pulling up your bio here for the introduction.
No, I have changed it a little bit, so if you will allow me to share my screen.
All right, all right.
That's okay. Let me try this. Okay, and let's do. All right, can you see my presentation now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Tell me when you're ready for me to go.
All right. Thank you very much for your patience. I understand Dr. Susan took on a new role, but briefly about Dr. Susan is that she began her 18-year career with FBI, where she still is, first as a forensic mitochondrial DNA examiner, and later as a supervisor for the DNA analysis group for the FBI's Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center. She's currently serving as a management and program analyst with the Chemical Biological Countermeasures Unit in the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate of the FBI, participating in outreach and countermeasure initiatives to prevent the production, acquisition, and misuse of biological agents. Dr. Kropp earned a doctoral degree in evolution and population biology from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. However, now she has a new title, so possibly she will update us about that before she then moves on to share with us about the U.S. Federal Select Agent Program of the FBI. You're most welcome, Dr. Kropp.
Thank you. Good morning. I am so sorry for not being able to be with you all in person today, but thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. As Ian has said, I'm from the Chemical Biological Countermeasures Unit in the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate at the FBI. I wanted to take just a brief moment before I get started on my presentation to explain to you exactly what the Countermeasures Unit does. So officially, the Chemical Biological Countermeasures Unit seeks to identify chemical and biological WMD threats and helps enhance public and private partnerships to better mitigate and respond to current or emerging threats. But practically, what does that actually mean? At least for my position, what it means is that we do a lot of training and outreach to academia and industry. And that's on a broad range, broad spectrum of biosecurity topics. The purpose is to help them understand how to protect themselves and their work, but it also helps us establish a relationship with them so that they can feel comfortable coming to us if they have questions about biosecurity, or if they have some concerns and they just need to know if there's something that they need to do about it. We also work with our government and law enforcement partners, both domestic and international, so that we can all be aware of emerging threats and biosecurity issues. So in short, we like to say we do everything possible to stay left of boom. And that's our way of saying, at least, from an explosive standpoint, we do everything we can to prevent an explosion from ever happening. And that can mean, the traditional bomb type of explosion, but also the explosion of a disease, of a GCBRI, that could affect everyone. So, yeah, okay. This is a standard disclaimer that we have to show in all our presentations now. And so I would just ask you to not record or take screen captures of my presentation. I know that that's very unsatisfying. That's just what I'm required to ask you to do. But I will say that if there's any additional information that you would like, or anything that you want to know about that I'm going to talk about today, please just contact me. I've already been contacted just during the course of this conference already about getting copies of my slides. And what I can do right now is share with you the material that I use to create the slides. So that will actually give you a whole lot more information than what is contained in these slides. So please do contact me, and I promise I will respond as quickly as I can, okay? All right, so as my title says, I'm going to talk to you about the U.S. Select Agent Program. So what is exactly a select agent? In determining whether to include an agent or a toxin on the select agent list, the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness Act in the United States requires that we consider the following criteria. the effect on human health or exposure to that agent or toxin, the degree of contagiousness of that agent or toxin, and the means by which it can be transferred amongst human beings, and the availability and effectiveness of therapies or cures to treat and prevent any illness that might result from infection of that agent and toxin. And also the needs of any other vulnerable populations, the elderly, children, that are necessary to establish what agents or toxins need to be on this list. So if something is an extreme threat, if it is easily transmitted between human beings, if there is no or very ineffective preventative measures or cures available for a particular agent or toxin, then it's more likely that that particular item is going to be placed on the select agent
Recording
list.
stopped.
So select agents are going to vary by country because each country has to decide what particular agents and biological toxins that are endemic in their country, which ones are most likely to be introduced or to be to which they have very little countermeasures. And so, at least in the U.S., the select agent list that we have, and I didn't put it up here again because it's going to vary according to what country you are in. The select agent lists here in the U.S. are reviewed and republished every couple of years, more often if it's necessary. And there are actually 4 components to our select agent list. There is the Health and Human Services Select Agents and Toxins. There's the USDA, that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Veterinary Service Select Agents and Toxins. The U.S. Department of Agriculture Plant Protection and Quarantine Select Agents and Toxins. So we're not talking just about bioorganisms that can affect humans, but also those that can affect agricultural animals as well as agricultural plants in the U.S. because that would affect our ability to provide food for the country. And then there's also an overlapping list of just select agents and toxins. So there's actually 4 sublists within our list. In 2016, in response to the World Health Organization's joint external evaluation, Uganda implemented a centralized national electronic database for dangerous pathogens. Now, this was a major accomplishment towards developing biosecurity and biosafety capacities. Why was this such an important step anyway? Because in the event of an outbreak, this kind of information will assist the Ugandan Ministry of Health protect the public from these infectious diseases. Knowing where these particular pathogens are, who and what institutions are handling them, can help trace where an outbreak might have occurred and prevent one from happening in the first place. The Federal Select Agent Program in the United States was established in response to a U.S. congressional mandate to ensure the safety and security of research with biological select agents and toxins. With oversight from the Federal Select Agent Program, entities are able to work as safely and securely as possible with select agents and toxins. This has led to very important scientific discoveries that have improved diagnostics and detection, treatment, and prevention of human, animal, and plant diseases. The FSAP, as we like to call the Federal Select Agent Program, is jointly managed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, specifically the Center for Preparedness and Response, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. Now, there are several things that this program are responsible for. The program, of course, is responsible for developing the regulations. They're responsible for maintaining the national database, those lists of select agents and toxins that I mentioned previously, but also maintaining where they are, and importantly, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a moment, the individuals who are allowed to handle those select agents. Because we also have to make sure that all the individuals who work with them undergo a security risk assessment. And that's where the FBI comes in, and that's why I'm talking to you about this today. And we also, the FSAP also provides guidance to those institutions that are able to handle these select agents. They provide regulations and help them develop guidance documents to be able to handle them safely. Again, these are our partners, the Department of Health and Human Services, very specifically within HHS, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, as well as the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and that's the Animal Plant Health Information Services. Below that, you see my sort of chain of command. The Department of Justice is the overall lead for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And within the FBI, we have the Bioterrorism Risk Assessment Group that does some of these assessments on individuals who are applying to be able to handle select agents. Now, this is what the basic process by which an FBI biosecurity risk assessment takes place. And when I say that, I'm talking about the individuals who would like to be qualified, who would like to be licensed to be able to handle select agents, because at least here in the US, it's not just that we understand where the institutions where these agents and toxins are handled, because that is certainly part of what the FSAP does, is those institutions have to undergo review and qualification to be able to work with these agents, but also the individuals within the institutions have to be qualified as well. So this is the process by which those individuals become granted the permission to work with these agents and toxins. So first of all, the institution for which they work will do a review of that person, and they will send an application to HHS and USDA and say, listen, this is a new person that we would like to be able to work with select agents. We are going to sponsor them. We think that they should be able to do this. And so from there, that background form that comes through the institution and is funneled through HHS and USDA gets sent to the FBI, and fingerprints are collected from that individual. That background form and that fingerprint card then go to our Criminal Justice Information Service, and of course that Bioterrorism Risk Assessment Group that I explained in the previous slide. All that information gets checked out by CJIS and BRAG. In addition, the FBI has database checks, and those are databases that are available to us, law enforcement databases, and there are a number of different databases that we check. We look at a person's criminal background to see if they have one, and to see what those incidents might be if they do have a criminal background. And the results of all of those checks then go back to HHS and USDA. So it is not actually the FBI who makes the decision, but we make the recommendation. We explain the results of the database checks and whether or not those meet specific criteria, or whether they would disqualify a person from handling select agents and toxins based on specific criteria that we'll talk about in a moment. And then that goes back to HHS and USDA for final disposition. So here are some of the provisions that we have for actually rejecting an applicant. So if someone applies to be able to handle a select agent and do research, there are a number of things, as you see listed here, that can disqualify them for being able to do those. And those are contained under two specific U.S. laws. First of all, the Usa Patriot Act. And as you can see, there are a number of disqualifiers, I guess you could say, that would prevent somebody from being able to handle a select agent, as well as the Bioterrorism Response Act. Now, a lot of these involve a criminal background. And so being convicted of a crime that is punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding a year, being a fugitive from justice, an unlawful user of a controlled substance. So these are all legal issues that would prevent someone from being able to handle a select agent. And I'm just going to let you go ahead and read through those. These, of course, are listed under the requirements for the U.S. Federal Select Agent Program, and those are all published online. And so, rather than read through all of these for you, we will talk for a moment about a practical example and show you exactly what that means. So the idea of doing this reliability and suitability personnel review is that we understand that there's a very broad risk spectrum. And the background form is designed to handle what we hope is sort of the lower end of that spectrum that might reveal information on a person that you don't need to check a special database or have access to the sort of criminal databases that the FBI has to be able to check that information. And presumably, depending on the institution, the institution that is applying for an individual to have permission to work with a select agent might see something on this background form themselves that would say to them, yeah, this isn't really somebody we want to be handling this in our institution. But then there's this other range, the higher, riskier range of the risk spectrum that the FBI's security risk or SRA assessment will actually reveal. And so with these two separate evaluations, the hope is that we will cover a very broad spectrum of the risks involved with a particular person handling a select agent or toxin. So as I said, let's take a look at an actual example of an applicant. Obviously, there are not going to be any names involved with this, but this is the actual risk assessment profile for an individual. So I will go through this sort of in detail, just so that you get an idea of the kinds of things that we see when someone applies. Now, so this person has applied, and the FBI has done their check and found in their criminal database that in 1986, for example, this person was convicted of fraud, and that with that fraud conviction, that was a misdemeanor. So there was no actual, so there was not prison time over a year, which is one of the disqualifiers. Again, in 1990, so 4 years later, they were convicted of theft by check, which is another sort of form of fraud. Again, another misdemeanor, but not prison time equaling or totaling a year. 5 years later, they were charged with assault with a deadly weapon. And that, aggravated assault is a felony in the United States. However, they were given a 5-year suspended sentence and probation. So they were not sent to prison. They had they had probation, not prison, and eventually that conviction was set aside. A couple years later, another assault with bodily injury. For whatever reason, those charges were dismissed. So there's no conviction and no prison time. Again, same year, same month, theft of property, but that theft totaled between $20 and $500. And so it was deemed a misdemeanor. And again, there was no prison time involved that would have been more than a year. another assault with bodily injury. So it was an assault on a family member. Because the circumstances of that assault, it was deemed a misdemeanor. Again, no prison time equaling a year. And finally, in 2011, they were charged with driving while intoxicated, so drunk driving, and possession of a controlled substance. At the time that this person applied to be able to handle a select agent, that those charges, those 2011 charges, were actually pending. So they'd been referred to a county attorney, a prosecutor, to determine whether or not that those charges would be, prosecuted. And so there was not actually any sort of resolution to those particular charges. So look at this yourself and think, just based on this information, is this someone you would want to work with dangerous pathogens or toxins? I know what I would say. I would have to say no. And you would think, just based on looking at this, you would think, well, certainly this person would have to be denied being able to do that. However, that is not the case. And this is why. The maximum prison imprisonment for misdemeanors, as I said, does not exceed a year. And in that list of restrictors that I showed you on an earlier slide, in order to disqualify someone, they would have to be convicted in a court by punishment of imprisonment exceeding a year. And so because this individual did not spend any particular conviction in prison for more than a year, that did not disqualify them. The applicant also didn't meet that one of the restrictors of unlawful user of a controlled substance, because that very last arrest of driving while under the effect of a controlled substance and possession of a controlled substance there was no disposition. There was no actual conviction of that crime. Now, the FBI will regularly check court records for final disposition on events that haven't been finalized when doing the background check on a person. And so if that person does happen to be convicted of a controlled substance, possession of a controlled substance, then they would be denied. But at the time that this was done, this person would not be rejected. And that's the only information that gets sent to HHS and USDA. So what else can be done? Well, of course, I hope what's obvious to you from these previous slides is it's very important to vet the individuals that are working in your lab. And even if you don't have the resources or a system to vet individuals in place the way the FBI does, even if you don't have that law enforcement access to be able to say, okay, let's do this law enforcement check on a person, you do have the ability to interview a person and get to know that person. And what I'd like you to do is think about the qualities that you might look for in a scientist. And here are some of the things that that come to mind, and hopefully they come to your mind as well. You obviously want that individual to be someone who knows what they're doing. You want them to be smart. You want them to have a good work ethic, obviously a good education. At least here in the United States, one of the things that they look for scientists when they're hired, particularly at universities, is that they have a good publication record, and other things. They have good skills, communication, computer skills, and that they're competent for the job that you're hiring them for. And I think that they're qualities that we all generally look for. Well, let's go to one more example, if you don't mind. And this is something that I've added in since the first time. What I'd like to do is talk to you about Diane Thompson, and we like to call her the Muffin Lady. And that will, let me tell you the story of Diane Thompson, and you'll see why we are. So on October 29th, 1996, this woman, Diane Thompson, sent an anonymous email inviting her colleagues at a hospital laboratory to help themselves to a batch of pastries that included donuts and blueberry muffins, which is why I call her the muffin lady, that she had placed in the hospital break room. 12 of the employees between morning and afternoon that day actually went to the break room and consumed those pastries. By 4 o'clock the next morning, all of those individuals started suffering the symptoms of gastroenteritis, and 5 employees actually had to go to the hospital to seek care, and 4 of them actually were hospitalized. In investigating what happened, why suddenly so many people in the same place got ill, the investigation focused on this woman. Let's see. So this is what happened. In investigating her, they discovered that this was not her first offense. In 1995, so a year previously, it turns out she had also given food tainted with an unknown pathogen to her boyfriend at the time. And he had similar symptoms to those experienced by her coworkers, including diarrhea and fever, and he had also been hospitalized. And as it turns out, what had happened is Diane Thompson had obtained Shigella enteritis from bacterium from a freezer in the laboratory where she worked, and she had used it to poison her boyfriend, to poison his food and his drink, and it wasn't detected that he had been sick from Shigella a year previously because she worked at the hospital and she actually altered his laboratory results. And so it was unknown exactly what had made him ill at the time. But then when this happened, this larger poisoning, and so many people became ill, that what she had done was finally uncovered. So she eventually pleaded guilty to 4 counts of tampering with consumer products. And what that means is that she contaminated them with Shigella that she was able to get out of the freezer where she worked. And she got 4 concurrent criminal prison terms, including a couple of years that was running concurrently for poisoning her boyfriend. Now, during court, she was actually unable to explain why she committed the crime, or unwilling, but she was very emotional at times during her testimony, and she often seemed confused as well. And so, according to testimony, she had used she had contaminated the muffins and the donuts with Shigella, and she also admitted to poisoning her boyfriend. So what exactly happened here? Well, unfortunately, this person, who was perhaps a little bit unstable, had access that no one realized that she had to a bacterium that could cause very serious illness. And in people who are immunocompromised, or very old people or very young people, at times, infection with Shigella can be fatal. So it wasn't just a minor thing that she had done. Apparently, one of her coworkers, when this all went to court, said that she kept reminding the coworkers about the pastries, and that she even walked them down to the break room and said, "There they are, please eat some." And so there were several problems that happened that allowed this to occur. First of all, she was perhaps not the most stable person, someone who should not have had access to a dangerous bacterium, but also, as was testified to during court, the hospital said that they actually had made changes in their procedures and the ways that people had access to things like Shigella, so that unauthorized people, and she was not authorized to access that particular bacterium, So they had to make changes to the hospital to make certain that people like that could not actually get access to various frozen bacteria. So as you can see, this wasn't even something that was intended to be a large-scale attack. There are some thoughts, although it never was made clear, that in an attempt to cover up the fact that of what had happened to her boyfriend, she then poisoned her coworkers as well. So it would look like it wasn't such an isolated incident, that her boyfriend had been poisoned. But again, we really don't know that for sure. So even something as simple as someone wanting to poison her boyfriend because he had decided to break up with her is something that we want to prevent, because it can become something larger very quickly. So what else can you do? As I said, if you don't have access to the kinds of information or the laws in place, actually, to do the kind of background checks that we do here in the U.S., to do the criminal history background checks, there are still some things that you can think about when you are deciding on who can actually handle dangerous pathogens or select agents or toxins. And so, in addition to those qualities that you want to see in a good researcher, in a good biologist, there might be some other qualities that you want to think about as well. Someone who is stable, someone who is kind and responsible, certainly someone who's nonviolent, someone that you can trust, a person who demonstrates that they can follow rules. And what I will say is that while knowing exactly where dangerous pathogens are being handled is it's a very good thing, and it's certainly the first step in being able to ensure that these dangerous materials don't get into the hands of someone if you don't want them to get into their hands. But then also knowing the individuals who are working with them. So even if you don't have the ability to do background checks or investigate these individuals, at least having a list, having a controlled list, and knowing exactly who is handling these materials also goes a long way towards knowing that you are maintaining the biosecurity of those particular agents. So I'm going to end there and take questions. There is my contact information. Your best bet for getting in touch with me is to use my my email address, because I always have access to that no matter where I am. And as I've said, I'm more than happy to provide you with the information that supports these slides, if not the slides. So I'll stop there. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kropp, for the wonderful facilitation. Any questions here or online? I have a question. Are there any other countries that you've supported in developing their own select agent program, or so far it's only observation from the US?
So are you talking about in terms of investigations or in terms of other countries that have this system in place?
Yes, are there other countries, the US, the FBI has supported to develop their own kind of systems to have that kind of verification?
So no, I mean, we have the authority based on US laws to be able to do these specific investigations here in the US, but we don't have we are not authorized to do those kinds of investigations for other countries, if that's what you're asking me. But again, that's as I mentioned, it's something that that we have legally in place in our country, and those investigations take place when someone applies to be able to handle selected agents, and so they know in advance that they're going to be investigated in order to be able to handle those items because they have to apply. So it's not something that we're just going and doing checks on people just randomly. It's a very specific application process, and it's something that people are informed of, and they know what they're doing when they are going into requesting to do these kinds of jobs. But to do these kinds of investigations for other countries, no, we don't do that.
Yes, the question specifically was looking at, you cited an example of Uganda having developed a list of select agents. I'm wondering whether you've reached out to support the Ugandan government in establishing their own investigation system, not necessarily the FBI investigating Ugandans, but the Ugandan government doing that kind of investigation.
Oh, in terms of saying, hey, here's how we do it. How can we help you set up the same system?
Yeah, yeah.
I can't speak for the whole FBI, but that is part of the reason why I'm here, is to talk about how we do it and put that idea in your mind. Maybe this is something that you would also like to do, and certainly, we do a lot of outreach, not just my unit, but the FBI in general. And I'm certain that if someone reached out and said, hey, there are pathways to do that, pathways, through our respective governments to say, hey, what do you think? Can you help us, and give us some advice on how, certain aspects that we should have in our system that you have in your system.
Great. And we have another question here.
Yes. Thank you for your speak. I would like to know if the SBI do the investigation if we send the sample from one country, the other country, no US, between two countries, different US. Do you understand?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite clear exactly what your question is.
For example, in two country, African country, if the US FDA do the investigation of selected agents.
Yeah, so the question is, do you investigate exchange of those select agents between other countries that don't include the US?
No, we don't investigate in other countries unless there's some invitation to help with something.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. I want to find out why this is put under the Department of Justice as opposed to Department of Health.
So it is under the Department of Health. Sorry, it was in my second or third slide. Of course, the program is under the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's just the background check part that the FBI conducts because we have access to the criminal databases to do the checks, not Health and Human Services. But the actual select agent program is under the Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. I want to ask how can you prove the misuse of pathogens? I know that it is difficult to make the difference between accidental or intentional harms from biological pathogens.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and that is an important thing that is an important distinction to be able to make, and that is again why law enforcement gets involved to be able to do those sorts of investigations to make that determination. Was this an accidental introduction? And certainly that is not. Sometimes it's a very simple. A very simple investigation, but not always. And I agree with you. Accidents do happen, and we understand that. but it's also important to do a thorough investigation. And in that case, we have investigators who are, especially qualified. We have our weapons of mass destruction WMD coordinators who are specially trained special agents. So they are agents, FBI agents, in each field office in the United States. And they're specially trained on all the modalities of WMDs. So chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive modalities. And they will often spearhead these investigations because they're specially trained to be able to recognize these types of events and to be able to spearhead those investigations.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions here or online? Yes. The microphone.
Thanks, Susan, for a very thorough and comprehensive overview of the process of personnel reliability. You gave us a great example of a real case where someone had a rather sketchy background of check kiting and also presumably family violence and perhaps drug use as well. And in that case, the FBI, because of the set of rules set out, was not able to recommend the person not be employed. Presumably, though, that lack of recommendation from the FBI would not stop the institution itself from saying, well, we've got this background check. Those are not characteristics that we want to employ. Or would that be a problem for the institution?
Well, so you are correct, but the results of that background check, I mean, those results are not made public. So the only thing that goes from the FBI back to HHS is that the person is not rejected.
Okay, let's recast that then. Is there anything
So if an institution wants to do their own background check and have their own investigator look for things in a person's background that they think might disqualify them, that is certainly their right. But that can be expensive, right? And not all institutions, although certainly institutions that are licensed to work with select agents and toxins have at least have the ability to, they're not going to be very small institutions because there are a lot of requirements that they have to put in place and I'm looking for a word, the qualifications that they have to meet to be able to have laboratories that handle these. So they may have better resources to be able to do that. But yes, the institutions themselves, and again, this is why I'm saying it's a good thing for you to also not just count on this, but to know the people that you are hiring, particularly the people that you are hiring to work with select agents and toxins or dangerous pathogens, whatever you want to call them. But you know that these are dangerous materials, potential GCBRs that you want to make certain are not going to get out. Then doing your own background check as best you can is probably a good idea. And that's up to the institution. They can make the final decision whether or not to hire a person.
Yes, we have another question here.
Thank you, Susan, for this presentation. Unless I'm so wondering about your disclamation about no video, no record, no anything. But anyway, I consider that this is a select agent. But on the other side, the select agent program website contains most of the information we are interested to get in. My question regarding for you is that regarding the project in Uganda. you're saying that the project is that establishment of the national inventory for the select agent or dangerous pathogen. My question regarding this program or this project, do you are involved in this project or not? This is one issue. Okay, if not, do you know how this project go on? I mean, how they collect the data, and who is responsible for fully controlled on this inventory? Is it the Ministry of Health in Uganda, or is it the Prime Ministry of Uganda, or the funder of the project is responsible or sharing by some way?
Okay, so no. Was I involved? No. Or the FBI involved. Sorry, I know you don't mean me personally, but no. I can certainly share. They have a publication on the development of that database. It's my understanding from that publication that is the Ugandan Ministry of Health that is responsible for the collection of that information and for the centralization of that data. But sir, I can certainly share with you that publication so that you can, and it has all the details. It's really fantastic.
Yes, please.
What they have
We
done
need
and
this
put together.
publication.
So I can share that with you. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other question here?
Oh, and sorry, just very quickly. We actually have to put that disclaimer for all of our presentations. It's not just this one, because it's on select agents, because certainly the information on the select agent and toxins program is publicly available, and I can certainly send you the links to the publicly available websites so that you can get the information on that. That's just something that we are required to do no matter what I'm presenting on. So, sorry.
Yeah, I have one last question for you. If any of these participants wanted to establish a similar arrangement in their countries, how would the FBI support them? What would the process of getting your support look like?
So certainly, you know, you contacted me with an email and asked if I would participate in this in this meeting, and certainly, it's a very good thing. I was actually able to attend the first Symbio Africa meeting, and that was wonderful. And I think that what you're doing here is fantastic. You're bringing the right people together to talk about an urgent problem, and you're trying to do it proactively. You're trying to take care of everything that you possibly can in advance to prevent something from happening. And we absolutely support that kind of proactive action. In terms of getting our support, you know, I would say that there are certainly a lot of steps towards doing this sort of thing. For example, Uganda put together their electronic list of dangerous pathogens and the locations, the institutions that hold them in response to the World Health Organization's joint external evaluation. And that's certainly a good start. And so that was not FBI assisted. That was, you know, they took information that was recommendations from the WHO and moved forward from that. And certainly the details in the that they have put in the publication on the establishment of that database are helpful to everybody. It's always, you can always make a request to say, hey, can you come and help us with something? Can you give a workshop? Can you teach us what you know? And that request can always be made. And then those requests get evaluated, you know, through our chain of command, I guess, for lack of a better term. To determine availability and practicality and that sort of thing. So that's certainly a request that can be made, and is certainly something that, you know, if someone contacts me and says, hey, we would like to have this, we would like you to come here and do a workshop. We would like to learn more about this. That is certainly something, that request is something that I could pass along to my management and say, this, we are getting this request. Is this something that we can do? Is this something that we can support? So without specific details as to exactly what someone would want, I can't say yes or no. And certainly it's not my personal final decision to help out. Ian, when you made the request to me, the first thing I did was go to my immediate supervisor and say, listen, this is a request I got. I think that we should support it. I would like to do it, and this is why. But then that decision was out of my hands after that point, until he went further up the chain as needed to whomever is able to make that final decision, and then came back to me and said, yes, go ahead and do it. So that's how that happens. We get requests all sorts of ways, yeah, if someone has a request, I'm happy to pass it along and happy to do whatever I can to help support that.
Great, thank you very much. So I hope all of us have had how we can start off having similar verification in our own countries. Shoot an email and pray that the management approves the engagement.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, there's a lot of steps that are involved with that. It's, as I said, it's not just the FBI, there's an entire process that involves not, the FBI is one portion of that, but as I said, the Health and Human Services and USDA, they're also big partners in the Select Agent program. So there are a lot of moving parts in that whole program. We're just one of them. And so I don't know exactly who else. I mean, clearly you would probably want to get information from other agencies in addition to ours.
Great. Any other questions? Online participants, any other questions? If not, would like to thank Dr. Susan Kropp for wonderful facilitation and for the invitation to collaborate. And we hope to have much more proactive action from our participants when they return to their respective countries. Thank you very much, Dr. Susan.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so that brings us to our first break of the day. We are going to break off for 30 minutes. We grab a cup of coffee or whatever is close to us. And then when we return, we shall have Mr. Olawoluwa taking us through setting up coordination mechanisms to foster public health emergency preparedness at national and regional level. So those online, you can also break off for 30 minutes and stretch or get a cup of coffee or food, depending on the time zone. And the same shall be doing here. So at 10